Hi, my name is Karen. Welcome to my channel if it's your first time here. And today I would love to talk to you about the books I've been reading lately. Specifically to start, Sunrise on the Reaping, which is the new Hunger Games book, which I thought was a really good and interesting continuation of the series. I really liked the Songbirds and the Snakes one, and I really liked that being from Snow's point of view. When we first open up with this one, I kind of had a few moments where I was not so into Haymitch's point of view. He doesn't ever come off as a super strong point of view character. It does feel kind of just like a narrator, and the Haymitch that I imagine from the Hunger Games did not necessarily come through in this book for a while, where I didn't feel like they were the same character I was hearing from. I now believe that is somewhat purposeful by Suzanne Collins, who is a very good and clever writer. So at the beginning of the book, it does not feel like the same Haymitch, but by the end we've gotten there, you know? So she does a good job of putting the character through a really significant change throughout the novel. But we hear at one point Haymitch go over his Hunger Games with Katniss. She's watched it, and you know, they say things like, "Oh, well, that was nearly as bad as what we did in the arena," and we don't even think to question if anything is altered or changed, even though we know that to be the case from Katniss and Peeta, that this is a huge propaganda machine, and yet here we are, the people who are thinking we already know everything going in, and then once we're actually in the arena with Haymitch, it's like, oh, this was very different from what I thought it was going to be. It's very clever. She's very clever at this, the Suzanne Collins stuff. There's just that little dig at AI that she gets in there. And there's one scene that I find incredibly unbelievable, which is President Snow just going in there, and I guess I don't really want to do spoilers, but there's a scene with President Snow where he does actually have a conversation with Haymitch, and I find it incredibly unbelievable. We've got Snow in here, and he's basically just trauma dumping onto Haymitch, and you're like, okay then, guess that scene's happening right now. Seems a little out of place. But ultimately, what I think makes it the most compelling is that we get to see the rebellion forming. We get to see that this isn't just something that was a one-off with Katniss, and that suddenly like she is the chosen one and the girl who's going to bring down the Capitol. This has been the work of generations, of a lot of people working together over a long period of time to try and get that spark finally to catch and get the girl on fire, as it may have been the boy on fire if it could have been Haymitch. We get a little bit more Covey information. We get a little bit more of some tie-ins. We get to see Katniss's family tree. We get to see Peeta and Katniss's parents both, and what they were like before the Capitol continued just to wear them down. It feels like a really good center place where we're seeing enough stuff from Songbirds and Snakes that feels like it's included in this universe, and then we're getting a lot of new stuff that I think will really influence how I read the Hunger Games now if I ever reread it. I guess I will eventually reread it. It's just been a little bit. I think also it does so well at kind of discussing how many generations does it take to change a population. And that's some pretty basic like counterinsurgency and nation building doctrine that's being thrown in there, where, you know, it takes 3 generations to change a population's point of view. It takes about 100 years, more or less, to take a group from believing one thing to believing another. And I think seeing that transition is done really well, where we have our perspective of how like the Covey reacted when they basically are trapped into the districts. Then we get kind of this middle era with Haymitch, and then we see how it feels like an endless oppression that is by the time Katniss's era, that there's no escape from the Capitol, and that there isn't really this memory of what was before the Capitol. We just accept all of it. And tied in there are just kind of little details where, say, Haymitch, we find out he could have afforded some sugar at different points, whereas we know from Katniss that they pretty much never could afford sugar. And the poverty you feel is much more extreme by the time we get to District 12 during Katniss and Peeta's era, whereas when we're here in Haymitch, it's a little less extreme. And then with the Covey, it wasn't quite as extreme. I don't think this should be your first Hunger Games book, but I think if you were to start with Songbirds and Snakes and then move on to this, that would make sense well enough, though obviously you're going to be missing all of the stuff about Katniss and Peeta. If you're somebody who's read the other 3 Hunger Games, then I think that you will enjoy these other 2. I never really enjoyed Mockingjay that much. Like, I really loved the first 2, but Mockingjay was kind of a dud for me. Still a very strong Hunger Games book, but just not one I really felt ever a call to go back to. Whereas Sunrise on the Reaping and Songbirds and Snakes both feel like on par to me for catching fire in the original Hunger Games book. Anyway, so that's that new release, which I guess isn't quite as new anymore. And then the next one in the release calendar that I have read was Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. And this is one where I'm probably a little bit biased because I have been following John Green for a very long time, and not in the context of just he taught me social studies or something in Crash Course. I've been following the Blog Brothers since, oh gosh, it's been a long time, like 2008, a long time. And I've enjoyed quite a bit of their work. I listen to their podcasts. Like I am the target audience for this book, but it's also a New York Times bestseller. So a lot of us are the target audience for this book. The thing I like about John Green books is that he does a really good job at connecting to his audience and making you feel something very deeply. That's why The Fault in the Stars was such a good book. That's why Turtles All the Way Down made me cry just as much. And then The Anthropocene Reviewed also is just such a great work of prose and poetry that it humanizes John Green to a really huge extent. So he takes that skill set that he has of being able to humanize pretty much anything and make you care about it. And he says, how about we talk about tuberculosis then? And by the end of it, you do care very deeply for tuberculosis and for Henry, who is kind of our point of view tuberculosis patient that John Green introduces us to. And it's clear that he has a super deep and super meaningful relationship with. Now, as somebody who's been following the Vlog Brothers for a long time in the podcast, I have been very aware of John Green's tuberculosis obsession, is that the right word? Fixation. The tuberculosis journey has been very apparent to those of us who have been on the platform watching. So like I already knew about Henry. I knew about Henry's YouTube channel, and John has talked about him. So he wasn't like a surprise character, but I was really excited to get to know him further within the book. You do get the feeling, though, with Everything is Tuberculosis, that John Green probably wishes it had been a couple of months later in its release date. So maybe he could have gone in and talked a little bit about the current state of USAID. I'm sure he has a lot to say about it. I think I may have missed some of it, but I'm sure that his platform has plenty of response to USAID in the current situation with tuberculosis treatment in Sierra Leone. So that's one part of it. The other part that's really good, because it is actually a history of tuberculosis. And as a hobbyist historian here, I thought it was a pretty good history. I actually would have enjoyed the history part being longer, but I think that the length of this book was partially by design. I think that John Green wanted it to be this length because it's a very quick read, it's an easy read, and it's very approachable. So a lot of people aren't necessarily looking to pick up a big doorstopper on tuberculosis, but something that's about 200, 250 pages, that's very consumable to most people, especially when it's written by John Green, who is a very readable author. Overall, I think it's a very, very strong book. I enjoyed reading about the history of tuberculosis. I had always known that it was like the consumption thing, but I'm more familiar with it as consumption, not as tuberculosis, especially in the modern era or the Gilded Age, where I kind of have a little bit of a blank in my United States history, if I'm being honest. I felt like it was filling in a gap of disease history in the United States, and then I knew before reading it the extent of tuberculosis, but again, that was because I heard about it from John Green earlier. And it is absolutely shocking that tuberculosis is as prevalent as it is, especially in like Africa and Southern Asia. You would think it's something that we would, as humans, would have dealt with, but fingers crossed that something happens. If there is any weakness in this book, it's a little bit towards the call to action. I kind of did leave it feeling like, well, I'm not really sure what I, human, am supposed to be doing about this. I understand that this is a large and systemic issue that probably governments and UN and various international organizations are going to have to deal with, though how effectively any of them are. And aid organizations are notoriously flaky, where they'll have a grant for a certain amount of time, they'll do what they can while they have the money, and then once it's done, it's dropped. And the unfortunate thing about tuberculosis is that it does need very long-term involvement. So if any of that stuff interests you, then I think this is a very easy and approachable read. I would recommend it. And if nothing else, I think it'll give some context to the whole cough in the napkin and then look, it's blood. Oh no, it's tuberculosis. Speaking of the Gilded Age, something that I read, this is not a new release by the way, but I just recently read it, is The Devil in the White City. I had never really thought about the Chicago World Fair before, and I kind of felt like I needed to have been to Chicago to understand the layout of the city a little bit. So I spent the entire time I was reading this Googling Chicago architecture and being like, that's what that building looks like. That's what that building looks like. I have no basis in Chicago geography. This book here, it's an Erik Larson. He writes these sort of fiction nonfiction books where it actually is what happened during the World Fair. And in this case, there's also a serial killer running around. So it's the factual things that we know about the serial killer, and he kind of puts it into the form of a narrative. And it is a very enjoyable ride, in my opinion. I learned a lot about Chicago and the Gilded Age and the World Fair. I thought this was really enjoyable, except for the part where it sort of felt like two books squished together. So the serial killer part and the World Fair part, they take turns basically alternating chapters. And the serial killer doesn't really have that much to do with the World Fair other than the fact that he, is building a hotel in the premise of the World Fair because he assumes it will lure a lot of women to his hotel so that he can kill them. And I guess that is as good a reason as any to squish these things together. But I did kind of feel like it felt like two separate narratives, almost like two different books that needed their own space to breathe. But I don't know if there was enough information here for two separate books. You could probably pump up the Chicago World Fair part of it and make it its own book. The serial killer one, probably not without adding like a lot of fake stuff. And I think the whole point is supposed to be it's only the information that we know. The part with the detective at the end is really good. And I was like on tenterhooks. I was really wondering what was going to happen. And it's crazy that all these crazy people get caught with something silly like tax evasion or not paying their bills. It's never the murder that they get arrested for. Obviously, why would they get arrested for that in Chicago? Finally, the book I'd like to talk about, and this is my newest really, is Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. It's her newest Emily Henry book. And unfortunately, I didn't love this one. I would probably rank it, I guess I can like pull up a little thing here. So my favorite Emily Henry book is Book Lovers, and then Funny Story, and then Beach Read, and then I think Great Big Beautiful Life. I think that I like this one better than Happy Place or People We Meet on Vacation. It's meant to be a grumpy sunshine. I don't know if we got to know our grumpy character that well, and the sunshine one is very sunshiny. I really think I'm kind of like a grumpy gal. I want them both to be grumpy. It's very similar to the Taylor Jenkins Reid Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which is a really good read for the Evelyn Hugo part of it, but the conceit of you've got this writer who is going to write a story for a famous person and this is their life, and we get to kind of go along for the discovery of who the famous person is and their secrets. Evelyn Hugo does the famous person better. Our old lady telling us the story is far more compelling. That was great. I left the entire time here feeling like I kind of need more investment on something happening in this woman's life, because it kind of feels like she's miserable the whole time and a shut-in the whole time because she can't go outside her door because she's famous, but we don't get any good anecdotes about her being famous. The closest is her being on a motorcycle with James Dean at one point, and that's it. And it doesn't feel very like a big life. It feels very claustrophobic and shut in from all of the press and the famous people, which is a little bit of a shame. And then on the other hand, I actually do like our sunshine character. I think she's very good. Alice is super enjoyable. Hayden, I don't feel like we get to know him very well. This is one where, you know how in all of these romance novels, there has to be some sort of trauma that everyone has to work through. And Alice, I think with her mom, is really well handled. But then we have Hayden, and his trauma is that his dad was a mayor of a small town, and he felt like he had to be perfect, which, not to dismiss anyone's trauma, but I can speak to this one because my family was also involved in small-time regional politics, and it's not very traumatizing. It really isn't. And maybe other people take to small-town regional politics worse than I do, but I don't think it makes you feel like you have to be perfect for your entire life. His mother having some mental health struggles, I think, should have been more explored instead of this other microscope aspect of it that he keeps bringing up. And it's like, dude, that's not that big a deal. You need to get over that. But anyway, Margaret Ives was supposed to be an interesting character, but I don't think had enough book to be an interesting character. And then the romance just needs to be reworked a little bit because we have Alice basically in love with Hayden really quickly, being like, you should trust him. He's great. And he does appear to be a pretty decent guy, but we're kind of told that more than shown that through the book. And I I just think that, and I can't believe I'm saying this because this is not a short romance novel, but it reads like women's literary fiction instead of a romance novel. So I think it needs about 200 more pages to make it a proper women's literary novel. It needs like 100 more pages with Margaret Ives that's fleshing out her youth and her wild days or her party days or what she was doing at different points after kind of her big trauma part happens. And the stuff with the sister really with Margaret should have been fleshed out more. That would be good. And then for Alice, the stuff with her sister should have been fleshed out more. And it just isn't. Like, you can tell that her feeling is that she had to be the perfect happy child because of her sister. And we don't get enough conversation about that, I think, ultimately. So that's where that book could have done a little bit better. I really think that Emily Henry basically has taken a turn into women's literary fiction in this. And I'm not upset about that. I like women's literary fiction too, but it just didn't quite eke it over the edge for me. And this one has got a good shot of being a movie because look, there it is, Reese's Book Club. So we should expect Reese Witherspoon to be producing a movie about this before we know it. Maybe she'll expand it a little bit more. This I could see being a really good movie though, because you get all the flashbacks with the young Margaret Ives and it could be kind of like fun and sexy and period piece. So, and I wonder if Reese would play, who would Reese Witherspoon play? She would play Alice's mother if she's going to take a acting role in this, I think, because Alice's mother is described as being just like effortlessly beautiful, and doesn't that just describe Reese Witherspoon? Anyway, those are kind of three newer release and one just that I wanted to talk about, books that I've been reading for the month of April. And yeah, that's that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these books, and I do recommend most of them. I don't know if I do recommend Great Big Beautiful Life. I guess I do if you're an Emily Henry fan. Big Beautiful Life isn't where I would start for Emily Henry novels. I would probably go with either Funny Story or Beach Read. Yes, that's what I would recommend. Otherwise, I think you should read the other 3 books because I had a good time reading them, and hopefully you will too. And that's all from me today. I will see you next time. Bye.